Well, first, let me begin by thanking the voters of the 1st Congressional District of Massachusetts for once again offering me a substantial mandate in terms of their consistent support over these many years. And secondly, allow me to congratulate Donald Trump as the president-elect. This is the 58th presidential election that America has held, and it's very clear that what happened last evening was a reflection of some of the changes that are coursing through the American political system. Theodore White, who perhaps better than anybody else began to chronicle presidential elections beginning in 1960 with his Making of the President series, stated in that text that America was Republican until 5:30. And after 5:30, America was Democratic. And last night, that did not hold up. I had a series of predictions that I offered, and I was only wrong in 4 states. The problem was that it was North Carolina, Florida, Wisconsin, and it appears to be likely Michigan. And I call attention to that largely because of what has been a very rancorous political season. And I'm ever so hopeful that President-elect Trump will be able to perhaps change the course of the conversation and challenge where necessary, but to cajole where necessary as well. And I think that the American people are ready for some conciliation and a path forward that would allow us to address some of the economic anxiety that is currently playing out across the country. My own take on that is essentially that we need to pay attention to the worker participation rate, which has slumped considerably. We need to pay attention to the role that technology is taking in terms of allowing employers, for a variety of reasons, to accomplish the same efficient end with fewer employees, and also to speak to the skill set that is currently plaguing the American economy. And while there was good news during the last 2 months on the jobs front, it doesn't address the issue of the number of people in America who are working 2 part-time jobs. And I think that that was part of what we had a chance to witness last night. Also, on the House front, it looks as though it was a net gain of about 7 seats. That is not satisfactory. The numbers on the House races now in 4 successive election cycles mean that the Democratic Party has lost 62 seats. And in terms of my own participation, the success I've had, and when I signed up for Congress and was first elected, there were 270 Democrats. By last night's tabulation, it'll be 199. And that could be a number that is not only stubborn, and I take that, let me qualify that, I think it's 191. Because I think that when you consider the 2 that were defeated and the 188 that we had, and then there were 3 vacancies. So that number goes to 191. So you can see the change that's pretty dramatic. And the other key figure that's worth noting is that in this round of legislative races across the country, the Democratic Party has now lost 835 seats, just in time the last go-round for congressional reapportionment. And I don't think that, that the conversation could be complete without calling attention to the fact that the anxiety of the working class in America now is a critical component of electioneering. And we, as Democrats, used to be able to depend upon Michigan. We used to be able to depend upon Wisconsin. And we were able to depend upon a wide diversity of voters across the country. That, last night, changed. So where can we find some common ground and a path forward? I think infrastructure. The president-elect has said pretty aggressively during the course of the campaign that he favors a big infrastructure program for the country. And I also think that there is room here for fundamental tax reform, not beginning the conversation with the idea that we should have a lower tax base or a higher tax base, but instead a tax base that includes the notion that we ought to improve the quality of life for all the American people. And I also think there's some room on the criminal justice front. There seems to be some bipartisan support amongst Republican and Democrats for addressing some of the sentencing guidelines that have been in place now for the better part of 3 decades. And how to pay for some of these things. I recently, with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady, requested from what is known as the Joint Tax Committee, scholars of the tax laws in America, and they are really smart, how much money is sitting offshore. And it is estimated that there is up to $2.6 trillion sitting offshore. Now, some of that includes tangible assets. So you're not going to be bringing back parking lots and automobiles and office buildings. But even there's a considerable amount of money that I think could be deemed worthy for the purpose of investing in infrastructure. And there used to be a period of time in the Congress where infrastructure was the easiest thing to do. Now even that has gotten caught up in the polarization that played out across the nation. So lastly, before I take some questions, once again highlighting how divided America is, I hope that we can change the language of how we talk to each other, not just in Congress, but across the country, and hopefully bring the American family to the idea that cooperation should be at the center of our political existence. But not to miss the point that in terms of the division, while Donald Trump won the Electoral College last night, it's likely that Hillary Clinton is going to win the popular vote, largely because California still hangs out there. And I'm hopeful that we again can speak to what unites us as members of the American family. There are going to be differences and there are going to be conflicts. But I also think that based on a couple of the notions that I outlined here, there's room for some cooperation. Questions?
Congressman, a lot has been talked about this election cycle, about the Republican Party having an internal civil war, internal fight against its different factions. Do you see the Democratic Party facing a similar challenge in the wake of this election?
I do. And I think that the Democratic Party at one time was the party of aspiration in America. And I think that we need to return to that idea of the aspiring. And I think on the Republican side, there is no question that there's going to be a considerable rift. If you would recall, the Speaker of the House refused to campaign with the President-elect. There were a number of senators across the country who would not even say who they were voting for on the Republican side. And in the House of Representatives, there were clear divisions over the nominating process that brought Donald Trump to the fore. So I'll leave it to them to figure out how they can best address those divisions. But on our side, not to miss the point based on the numbers I gave you earlier, there's reason for consternation. I mean, you cannot go through these election cycles now that I've described and say after 4 difficult election cycles that I might even describe as bad, that the net gain is 7 seats? Yeah. Likely. Si?
Congressman, do you think that, this would have to be a gut feeling on your part, do you believe that the President-elect will moderate any of his more controversial stands now that he's been elected president?
Well, I find...
And what would those be, in your opinion?
I don't want to just offer partisan speculation. I find it hard to believe that the Mexicans are going to build a wall for us and then pay for it. I find that very difficult to convince anybody of. And I also think that whether we like it or not, it's going to be very hard to try to deport 11 million people. And, you know, when you look at these issues, and you've been around the way I have, we used to pay attention to facts, and now opinion is the overriding issue. So if I were to say with accuracy that 1 million people went back to Mexico last year, I know it's hard to believe, but they went back. And the numbers have slowed down, and since 2010, there's been very little in migration. But that doesn't speak to the emotional side of the issue. And I also think that trying to reconcile perhaps the idea of a skill set with immigration is more likely, but there is a large part of the Republican base that wants a wall built and financed by Mexico.
Two big issues I think that affect
Yeah.
And the second is Social Security. And unfortunately, the nature of the campaign did not reveal very much about how these candidates.
You notice that, yeah.
It's nuts. But Obamacare, he keeps pledging that's going to be the first priority. And I just don't know how you can accomplish.
Let me cite an example, though, of how it can be done, how some changes could be made. First of all, when George W. Bush offered a new entitlement called Medicare Part D, if you remember, there was a donut hole. So you had to spend down X number of dollars before the benefit kicked in, and then the benefit went away until you spent more dollars. So we then won the majority in, I think, 2006, and what did we do? We fixed the donut hole, looked at the plan in the rearview mirror and said, it's fine, it works. Nobody even talks about it anymore. We have voted more than 60 times in the House of Representatives to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now, part of the argument here, again, that's important, I understand the politics of it. When people say repeal, the problem is we hear the argument replace, we just never hear what's in replace. And recall that the mandate, which was unveiled by Governor Romney in Massachusetts, it's really the glue that holds the ACA together. So 20 million people, by all agreement, have now received health insurance, emphasis on preventive care. But there is the acknowledgement that a lot of big insurers have moved away. So the school I graduated from in politics says, let's figure out how to keep them in the game. Now, I can't imagine that we're going to give up pre-existing condition. I can't imagine that we're going to give up keeping 26-year-olds on their parents' health insurance. I can't imagine that we're going to uncap lifetime benefit. I mean, I look at all of these issues, and I think when you look at the Affordable Care Act in general, people disagree with it. When you sort through the specifics, they have a far better view of it.
Do you think there's a school of thought within the Congress itself that you can't just throw the whole thing out and then actually down the details, they'll try to fine-tune it?
I think you're going to have to fine-tune it, but I'm okay with fine-tuning it, to your point. Recall this, Medicare had to be refined from the time Johnson offered it in 1965. Roosevelt in 1935 offered Social Security, actually proposed it in 33, offers it in 35, and we've had to fix Social Security a number of times during the course of its existence. But I will say this to you, that Social Security is not going away, and Medicare is not going away. They are very popular initiatives with the American people. Good question, yes.
On the question of the entitlement reforms, the House Speaker promoted a plan to turn Medicaid into a block grant program. Just give the money to the states, let them figure it out. President-elect Trump seemed to endorse that during one of the debates when he was asked about it. What's your view on that idea?
Well, I prefer not to. I think that we're better to keep that the way it is. It's about 60% federal support and 40% state support for Medicaid. And also to remind all that during the course of the campaign, the president-elect also said, leave the entitlements alone. They were fine.
Congressman, you're going to be facing a Republican House of Representatives, Republican Senate, and Republican White House, and most likely more Republican-leaning Supreme Court. I guess, how do you envision your next 2 years in Congress under President Trump?
Well, I hope, as I described, on the infrastructure front, on the tax reform front, and criminal justice reform front, I hope that we'll find some common purpose and again, the opportunity to figure out how to go forward. And at the same time, there is no question that one of the downsides of majoritarian government, there's a clear responsibility to govern. So that changes all of a sudden. It's no longer one party blaming the other party for holding up what they've tried to do. So instead, now with, as you've accurately described, a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House, there's also the challenge of governing.
Are you optimistic about the chances of President Obama's legacy being maintained in any respect, and everything that's been pledged so far seems to be just sort of, pulling back the policies that he pushed over the last 8 years.
Well, again, I think as they try to do it, then you get to get a better idea as they unfurl their competing plan. But I also want to say this about Barack Obama. He leaves office with personal dignity in tow. I mean, it's been a remarkable 8 years in that sense. He has been a very dignified figure in American public life. And I also think that we can point to a number of accomplishments, but I hope that the Democratic Party does not do what was done to Barack Obama when on inaugural night 8 years ago, they met and decided to oppose everything that he was going to propose. And the danger is, Shannon, remember there were a number of Republicans who voted for the establishment of Medicare. There were a lot of Republicans who voted for the establishment of Social Security. There were a majority of Republicans who voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the U.S. Senate, which is arguably the great piece of social legislation in the last century. And with the Affordable Care Act, not one Republican voted for it.
Congressman, speaking on that topic, in terms of, you mentioned cooperation, and as previously mentioned, the last time we had the Congress and the presidency controlled by one was 2008. And as you mentioned, the decision for the Republican Party to not cooperate at all appears to have been a winning strategy. Is that a strategy that Democrats should consider from now on?
Well, it may have been a winning strategy in the short term in terms of electing a president, but not to miss the role that the popular vote played last night either across the country. And, the next round of congressional elections comes pretty fast. And one of the difficulties is that the president's party in the first midterm election tends not to do very well. So I think that the public understands resistance, but not to confuse resistance with obstruction. And I think that principle is very important. And legislating, when I signed up, again, was an art form. It was a skill set. You made tireless efforts in rooms where nobody ever paid much attention to, day after day after day, until you found an agreement or an opportunity for an agreement. And today, the Congress is more emboldened by crusaders as opposed to legislators. And it's more about the talking points, and it's more about the 8-second soundbite. And when you consider that, as I described it earlier, a worker participation rate that at last report was 62.9%. That's down from the historic post-war norm of 66%, which essentially meant that after World War II, by and large, 2/3 of the American people worked. Today, there are 8 to 9 million people who are estimated to have left the workforce, and we don't know where they are. So these are the kinds of topics in the background that, as you can tell, I readily enjoy reading about and describing and talking about how to resolve it. But I hope that some of the tension and the incendiary commentary that marked this campaign season will now be in the rearview mirror.
Go ahead.
How do you account for the fact that all polls and pundits seem to have gotten this completely wrong? A lot of people are waking up this morning completely surprised by the results.
Yeah, the great part of your question. Yeah, they were surprised. Yeah, the great part of your question is nobody ever goes back to check what the pundit said. I mean, that's the real challenge. And I was watching last night, I was flipping back between the stations, and as the results didn't improve, I said, well, maybe I'll tune into another station. They'll give me a better view. And so I thought that the pundits began to shift just about 9:30. And I saw John King at CNN begin to switch. Mark Shields is an old hand. He knows what he's talking about. And then even at NBC and CBS, they began to kind of do what we call the two-step. And I watched their results not square with what they had promoted the previous evening. And previous evening said Clinton by 3 to 4. So they missed voter enthusiasm. And I want to plead guilty on one front. I had exit polling from the Clinton campaign that showed that she had a decent lead in North Carolina and Florida. And I'd say decent, given their histories, 2 points. But a substantial lead in Wisconsin and a substantial lead in Michigan. I never thought she was going to win Ohio. I never thought she was going to win Iowa. I looked at the polling. She had not once been ahead in those states. Made it close at a couple of points where it was essentially tied, but never really ahead. So those are substantial trends. And I think in the punditry, it's kind of up to the media to be the gatekeepers. And one of the big changes I've seen in the course of my time, the media used to be the referee. And now with all the punditry, you wonder who they're working for, some of them.
What about polls? Up until 2 weeks before.
Polling was bad on Brexit. Polling was bad if you were Mitt Romney. You didn't even prepare a concession speech because you were so sure you were going to win. And I use Real Clear Politics, and I use Nate Silver. And last night at about 10 o'clock, I've been following Nate Silver for weeks, and Nate Silver regularly had Clinton in that 75 to 80% category for victory. Last night at about 10:30, a friend of mine said, Nate Silver's got it at 82% that Trump's going to win this thing. I mean, that all changes that quickly. So I think that the problem with polling is now trying to get people to stay on the phone, and it's impossible to get young people to stay on the phone. And the internet tends to have some inaccuracies. And even last night, if you were watching it very early, I mean, I knew the polls were going to close in North Carolina at 7:30. So that was my big one right away. I discounted Kentucky and I discounted Indiana because I knew that there was no chance she was going to win those 2 states. And then got a bit of a breath of good news when she won Virginia. I said, we're back in the game. And we were. Problem is, Wisconsin and Michigan were not back in the game yet. And Ohio, again, long gone. And, you know, the press promoted the idea, too, that this was competitive in Texas and it was competitive in Georgia. I was dismissive of that. There's no chance of that. That was never going to happen. But the narrative was developed that this was going to be, and part of that, incidentally, the campaigns put out. So I watched with some amazement in the last 72 hours that Donald Trump flew to New Mexico. I couldn't figure out what that was about. And then flew to Minnesota. I mean, the Republicans haven't won Minnesota since 1988. And I couldn't figure out what that was about. And I thought, well, geez, maybe he's going to Minnesota because the free media will spill over into Michigan or Wisconsin. I thought, maybe that's what this is about. But that wasn't the case either. So it was a bit of a head fake. It worked, even though Secretary Clinton decided not to go back to Wisconsin.
Congressman, where do you think Hillary Clinton's campaign went wrong? Exit polling seems to suggest that
Yeah.
she didn't get the turnout that she needed.
Right. And I also think there's another issue that is here. We had a very fractious primary season. And it unveiled a lot of weaknesses with our 2 candidates. And Republicans quickly seized upon, as anybody would, seized upon those perceived weaknesses. And clearly, the length of the primary and caucus sessions, they just go on too long. You know, Jack Kennedy ran in 6 primaries in 1960, and Teddy Kennedy ran in 40 in 1980. It's now the primary du jour, and it's hard to look good over that period of time. So we actually witnessed last night the culmination of 2 years of campaigning. And I think, again, the nature of who's ahead and who's behind and the analysts adopting those positions makes it very, very hard to figure out really who is ahead or who's behind. And the press, I'll just say this to you ever so diplomatically, the press tends to cover the horse race nature of the campaign. So the issues kind of get shoved to the side where, I mean, I'm happy to talk about GDP, and I'm happy to talk about worker participation rates, and happy to talk about you name it. And somebody like Cy who covered me, I could talk about zone changes at one time and budgets and all that stuff too. But that's what we were all accustomed to doing. And now it's more along the lines, whether we like it or not, of the entertainment value of the news.
Can you just comment about the historic nature here? I mean, Secretary Clinton is viewed as one of the most qualified people to ever run for president, and she got beat by a total novice, somebody who never run for office before, never held office before. Can you just comment on the historic nature of this huge upset?
Well, I can highlight that because even with exit polling yesterday, when people were asked who was more qualified to be president, 2/3 of the voters said Hillary Clinton. And even the negative rating, not encouraging for either one, was in her favor. And I think that part of the problem was that the email controversy never went away. And I also think that the Comey announcement sort of stopped independent voters, who now, by the way, are the ones that make up the difference in American politics. You know, when you consider where the 33% of the electorate is Democrat, something like 27% is Republican, there's a vast trove of independent voters. And I think that the Comey announcement certainly slowed any momentum she had with independent voters. Yeah.
We have a competing event going on.
It's not a problem. It's where you want to be.
You understand?
I do.
Yes, you do.
My feelings are not hurt. John?
I think this concern on the part of the public, one of the more long-lasting, potentially long-lasting effects of this negative campaign is the racial animosity that the president-elect stirred up. Do you see that dying in any way, or getting worse, or how can the country deal with this?
Well, I'm hopeful that we have the ability to have a candid conversation about it. I think what's interesting is that Barack Obama, 8 years ago, got more white votes than Al Gore or John Kerry. Pretty remarkable. I mean, that's kind of left out of the conversation. And I think that it was a surprise to me about the racial animus that was on the campaign trail, but do I think that that was the sole issue? I don't. I really don't. And I do think that we need to have that conversation going forward, and we can't do it on a piecemeal basis, so I'm ever so hopeful that that'll be part of where we head. The President-elect also said some pretty bold things about what he was prepared to do in inner cities. Now there's a chance.
One last question. So it seemed like it was an unprecedented race in a lot of ways, but it seemed particularly in the lack of decorum between the candidates in the media, and between the candidates in the American public in a lot of ways. Do you think this is going to become the new norm or baseline for future campaigns, or was this sort of a one-off with all the issues that existed?
Well, you know, when you listen to Al Gore's concession speech after 2000, where he had received, by some estimates, 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, he called attention to Stephen Douglas's concession speech as it related to the election of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden we're going back to Lincoln-Douglas style debates, but I do think that the American people are tired of the negative campaigning, and I think that they're tired of the invective that now courses through the American political season. And I also think that they're tired of the enablers who allow this to happen. And a more thoughtful, deliberative approach, a more judicious approach. And it's compare and contrast, sift and sort, and then you make up your mind. But the use today of incendiary, excitable, charged language to make a point ill serves all of us.
Congressman, yesterday morning, women and voters across upstate New York flocked to Susan B. Anthony's gravesite. They were proud to have voted for a female nominee after 200 plus years of male candidates. What effect do you think last night's election will have on the fight for women to get into the White House? Do you think it'll have a chilling effect and discourage women from entering politics, or do you think, just seeing her on the ballot will inspire more women?
I think having seen her on the ballot, it's going to inspire more women. And I think that in this case here, again, whether one likes her or dislikes her, she's checked off every box in American life and had a rich experience. She proposed a path to the White House, but the voters rejected it. And I think that second-guessing the voters ill serves all of us, but never to miss the point that I think that she cut a new path.